Welcome to the Undead Sages podcast, where we travel back in time to talk to long-dead wise men and women. My name is Marijn de Haan, and today we'll continue our inquiry into the thinking around violent resistance. Today, we often take resistance as a right, even a duty, but it wasn't always so. To rise up against power was once treason. Now it's a cry for justice. And yet, the moment you claim that right, you awaken something unpredictable. Fighting injustice may restore dignity, but it can also unleash darkness, terror, betrayal, even ecstasy. In this series, we speak with those who resisted, and those the world tried to silence, saints and revolutionaries, mystics and militants. Their words are sharp, their choices costly. You may not agree with them, but if you've ever clenched your fists in the face of injustice, then this is your conversation too. This is Resist. Last week, we interviewed Mahatma Gandhi, the consummate non-violent resistance fighter. For Gandhi, dignity and the virtuousness of the soul was more important than getting his way. Using any kind of violence would taint the soul and disrupt our vital connection to the sacred dimensions of life. This was too high a price to pay, Gandhi felt, and it would only render his people more likely to inherit the violence by which the British ruled. Our guest today is a man who embodies the polar opposite. Maximilien Robespierre used violence as a tool to achieve dignity, to heal the body politic of corruptions. Without virtue, the French Revolution would be a failure and would only produce new systems of oppression. To properly understand him, we'll need some context. France, 1789, a kingdom on the brink. The people are starving. Bread prices skyrocket after years of failed harvests. The monarchy is bankrupt. And across Europe, kings watch nervously as revolution stirs. In Paris, the Bastille falls. The king is dethroned, then executed. War breaks out on all borders. Civil war ignites at home. Amid the chaos, one man rises, Maximilien Robespierre, a lawyer from Arrahhs, incorruptible, driven by a vision of a virtuous republic. But as fear spreads and enemies multiply, Robespierre turns virtue into law and law into terror. Thousands are executed in the name of liberty. Friends become traitors overnight. The guillotine becomes a tool of purification. Then, in the summer of 1794, the revolution devours its own. Robespierre is arrested, silenced, and executed, jaw shattered, words unspoken. He dies at the age of 36. Now we go back in time to hear from the man himself. Mr. Robespierre, welcome to the podcast.
Merci.
Let's begin at the beginning. Can you describe the arc of your life?
I was born in Arrahhs in 1758. My mother died when I was 6 and my father disappeared soon after. Whether from grief or cowardice, I cannot say. My siblings and I were raised by family. We had little, but we had dignity. I learned early that the world rewards cruelty and punishes virtue. I learned to think for myself and to trust the quiet authority of conscience. In Paris, I distinguished myself. I was not drawn to the fashionable cynicism of the elites. I found Rousseau. He spoke not merely to the mind, but to the soul. Man is born free, but everywhere in chains. That line reshaped my life. I didn't treat it as philosophy. I treated it as a fact of law, a call to justice. I became a lawyer, returned to Arrahhs, and practiced with integrity. I defended the poor. I rejected bribes, refused to flatter the powerful, and resisted every temptation to become like the men who had made France what it was: corrupt, indifferent, disdainful of the people they ruled. That was the early fight. Then came 1789. The monarchy, bloated with centuries of impunity, was forced to call the Estates General. I was elected as a deputy for the Third Estate. The people had at last found a voice, and I tried to be its echo.
But you became more than a voice. You became a symbol of the revolution. Some would say its executioner. How did you go from defending the poor to presiding over the terror?
Because the world did not change when it was asked politely. The old order did not fall when reasoned with. I saw the early revolution nearly strangled by timidity, by moderates who thought liberty could be negotiated with monarchs, or that justice could be purchased in salons. From the beginning I refused compromise. I opposed war when others thought it would export the revolution. I saw that war would empower generals, not citizens. I opposed the king when others still bowed to him. I believed the republic cannot coexist with a throne. They all said I was too severe, but the truth does not soften itself to accommodate fear. When the king was executed, the revolution faced war abroad, treason within, starvation in the streets. What would you have had us do? Trust that the old elites would suddenly embrace equality? Wait while foreign armies marched on Paris? We took power in the Committee of Public Safety, not out of desire, but necessity. The Republic was in peril, and I have never believed that freedom can be preserved without vigilance, or defended without force.
But why invoke virtue to justify that force? It's a moral term, not a political program.
That is where most people err. Virtue is not abstract. It is the only true foundation of a free society. Liberty without virtue becomes license. Equality without virtue becomes envy or tyranny. The Republic must be moral or it will rot. When I speak of virtue, I do not mean sentiment. I mean public spirit, civic sacrifice, incorruptibility, the willingness to place the common good above personal interest. In a monarchy, the law serves the king. In a republic, the law must serve virtue, justice, equality, reason. But law alone is not enough. The habits of despotism linger long after crowns are broken. Greed does not retire. Indifference does not surrender. I saw these forces still at work, in the profiteers who starved the poor for grain, in the deputies who plotted for their own elevation, in the journalists who inflamed chaos for coin. If we had simply removed the monarch and left the old habits intact, we would have replaced the tyranny of birth with the tyranny of wealth. So yes, we had to do more than change institutions. We had to cleanse the civic body of what made monarchy possible in the first place.
But that's where your critics would say you went too far, this idea of cleansing the civic body. That language is dangerous.
It is dangerous to the guilty, yes, and it should be. The revolution was not a social club. It was a radical rupture with centuries of injustice. The old regime did not merely rule with muskets and taxes. It rules through the corruption of character, teaching people to obey out of habit, to climb by flattery, to endure inequality as fate. I saw what many refuse to see, that freedom without moral transformation is a dead letter. You cannot build a republic atop the vices of monarchy. We had to demand more from the citizens than obedience. We had to ask for responsibility, for active virtue. No, I understand the discomfort. But would you rather we had demanded nothing, allowed the same men who gorge themselves under the king to become ministers under the republic? That is not justice. That is surrender.
But your method of demanding virtue, through coercion, through execution, how do you reconcile that with liberty?
I reconcile it precisely because liberty must be defended. Look at the world we were in. Famine, foreign invasion, counter-revolution, conspiracies daily. We did not act in a vacuum. We acted in the teeth of annihilation. What we called terror was in truth vigilance armed with law. It is not coercion to punish traitors. It is not tyranny to defend a republic against those who would dismantle it. Those executed were not innocents plucked from peace. They were the architects of corruption, the profiteers of misery, the double dealers who smiled in the convention and plotted in shadows. I took no pleasure in death, but I did not flinch from it either. Would you prefer a revolution that collapsed in on itself because no one dared name its enemies?
So you deny that the terror became indiscriminate?
I deny that it was arbitrary. Could it have been tighter in scope? Perhaps. But remember the scale of our enemies. This was not a legal dispute. It was civil war wrapped in revolution, foreign invasion wrapped in treason. We did not act with cruelty. We acted with clarity. Each case was reviewed. Charges were based on actions, not opinions. It is easy from the comfort of distance to call it excess. But without that firmness, the Republic would have died in its cradle.
Yet in your final days you turned on allies. You stood nearly alone. Doesn't that suggest something went wrong?
It suggests only that fear is a poor ally. My colleagues grew nervous not about guilt, but about being judged. They saw in my refusal to compromise a mirror they did not wish to face. I did not attack them for their politics, but for their corruption, for using power to enrich themselves while the people still starved. In my final speeches, I called for moral regeneration, not obedience to me. I proposed no dictatorship. I proposed virtue, applied without favoritism. That frightened them more than any guillotine. So they conspired. I was arrested without trial, shot in the jaw to silence me, executed like a criminal. I died because I would not flinch in the face of hypocrisy.
And yet, was it worth it? The republic you dreamed of did not survive. Napoleon rose. The terror is remembered with horror.
What survives of a revolution is not always what was intended, but that does not mean it was futile. The monarchy is gone. The people have tasted sovereignty. The idea that a man can be born free and must be treated as such is now law, not poetry. Yes, they crowned a general and called it stability, but even Napoleon wore the cloak of the revolution. He ruled in its shadow. That shadow will never disappear. I do not measure success by comfort. I measure it by transformation. And France is transformed. No longer a nation of subjects, but of citizens.
But morally, do you still stand by it all? The executions, the purity tests, the atmosphere of fear.
I stand by the necessity of what was done. I do not ask for indulgence, only for understanding. The stakes were absolute. We could not permit the revolution to become a halfway house for cynics and careerists. We demanded something higher. Fear, yes, there was fear. But the greater fear was that we would do nothing and be buried under another crown, another hierarchy, another betrayal. I still believe, if the revolution must err, let it err on the side of justice, not indulgence, on the side of the people, not privilege.
And if you had lived, if you had continued?
Then perhaps the Republic would not have been abandoned. Perhaps we would have completed the moral education of the citizen. Perhaps the law would have stood above profit and power alike. But that is speculation. I gave what I could. I acted as my conscience demanded, and if I fell not as a tyrant, but as a sentinel who refused to sleep while the people were in danger.
One final question. If the revolution did require such sacrifice, such discipline, can it ever really belong to the people?
That is the paradox. The people must be free, but they must also be virtuous. Liberty is not the freedom to do whatever one wants, it is the freedom to do what is just, and justice must be defended even against those who misunderstand it. We ask the people to rise to their highest selves. Some call that impossible. I call it revolutionary. Let them remember me as they will, but let them also remember this. I did not betray the revolution. I demanded that it means something.
Maximilien Robespierre, thank you so much for appearing on our podcast. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Undead Sages podcast. Next week, we'll talk to Rosa Luxemburg, another soul who has resisted, although again in quite a different way. Make sure to be here for next week's episode, as it's bound to shed new light on this fascinating area of human experience. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please share it with your friends, rate the episode, leave a comment, and subscribe to the podcast.